Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so stoked that you're here for episode 35 of the show. I'm incredibly excited to talk about this week's game, but before we do, let's get a few things out of the way. First off, part of what makes this whole podcasting thing fun is interacting with each one of you. When I look at the stats for the show, you reach just a number on a screen. So, when I get the chance to actually interact with you, it helps me put faces to those numbers and is a whole lot more fun. It seems like gamers are often stereotyped as hermits who avoid people at all costs, but I found that rarely to be the case. Most of us love to talk and game with friends because we share a common passion for gaming, and I'm the same way with the show. That being the case, don't be afraid to shoot me an email to klutchkittengaming@gmail.com or a DM on Instagram at klutchkittengaming. This week I received a ton of questions, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to answer a couple. The first question comes from Kyle, who asks, what is the hardest game you've ever played, and did you beat it or give up? The first game that immediately came to mind was Celeste. Not only do I suck at platformers, but the B-side levels are absolutely insane. I don't think I've ever completed one of those levels, so no, I did not beat it, Kyle. Our second question comes to us from Haley, who's also known as Clunky Mechanics, who asked me to pitch a game based on a cooking show. This was a real thinker because it's hard to take my mind off Overcooked 2 and Battle Chef Brigade. Those are just both excellent cooking games, but I'll see what I can whip up for you. My wife and I are both huge fans of Top Chef, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the show, I would describe it as 65% cooking competition and 35% reality TV. So here's where I'm thinking this game should go. Cooking RPG. First off, your character would have a bazillion different skills to level up. Cooking, baking, charisma, speed, luck, etc., etc., etc. On top of that, you would also be managing friendship statuses, kind of like in Stardew. If you're friends with the grocer in town, maybe you'll get food for cheaper. If you make friends with some of your competitors, maybe they'll lend a hand in the next competition. If you make friends with the judges, maybe they'll be a little bit more lenient next time you put too many microgreens on your plate. I could get way deeper into what this game would be, but I'll spare you the boredom. Hopefully that answers your question and gives you just a taste of what a cooking RPG could be. Kyle, Haley, and everyone else who sent in questions, thank you so much. It's a ton of fun for me to answer them, and please keep shooting me more. I'll hopefully get to them in some future episodes. In addition to sending in your lovely questions, you can also support and interact with the show through giving it a 5-star review on iTunes. This week we have one new 5-star review from my good friend Beximus, who's also known as Sofa Gamers. He said, I really enjoy listening to the Clutch Kitten Gaming podcast while driving or cooking. Congrats for the deep, clear, and summarized analyses of the indie games you play, James. Keep up the great work. I'll keep listening for sure. Beximus, I ended up cutting out a bit of your review because I don't think I can handle reading so much praise about myself. I truly appreciate the kind words, and I'm so glad that you started listening to the show. Last but not least, let's take a look at some gaming news. Our first item is actually old news, but I think a reminder is in order. If you're like me, I live for game sales. I scour the eShop and Steam every couple of days for those 50, 60, 70% off deals, but you know what's even better than cheaper games? Free games and free services. The first thing I want to remind you about is that Epic is giving away a free game every 2 weeks. If you've been reluctant to download the Epic client because you think they've ruined PC gaming, I would encourage you to download it if only so that you can get some of these free titles. A few that I've already gotten have included What Remains of Edith Finch, Subnautica, Slime Rancher, Oxenfree, and on the 18th of April, Transistor will be free. The games they're giving away aren't all amazing, but there are some really solid titles on there, as you can tell. The other sort of free thing I want to mention is that if you have Amazon Prime, they're currently giving away a free year of Switch Online. Apparently you can claim 3 months now, and then after 60 days, you can receive another 9 months. What's even more awesome is that even if you already have Switch Online, this reward can be tacked on. I know there's been some debate as to the value of that service, but in this case, free is free. And if you're already subscribed to Prime, you might as well pick it up. Let's move on now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Return of the Obra Dinn, which is a 3D, 1-bit mystery adventure game. Yes, you heard me right, 1-bit. The art style alone was enough to turn my head toward this game, but as we'll find out in a bit, the gameplay is also incredibly unique. Return of the Obra Dinn was released on October 18th of 2018 and is available on PC and Mac. It was developed by Lucas Pope, who's based in Japan, and who did pretty much everything in this game save the localization. If you're unfamiliar with him, he came from working at Naughty Dog on Uncharted 1 and 2, and once he broke out on his own to develop indie games, he became best known for Papers, Please. Currently, Return of the Obra Dinn costs $19.99 on Steam, and according to HowLongToBeat.com, it takes anywhere from 8 to 10 hours to beat. There is gamepad support in addition to the obvious mouse and keyboard support, but I would say that it really doesn't matter what you use. Pretty much as long as you can control movement in the game, you're golden. Let's move on now to talk about the narrative. Being an insurance adjuster isn't generally too exciting. If you were to ask me yesterday if I liked my job, I would have told you that it bored me half to death. That's yesterday though. My answer today is much different because things like this don't occur often. You want to know what happened? Let's just say that when a ship filled with over 200 tons of goods and 60 men and women go missing for 5 years, and then that ship happens to drift into port without a single soul alive, it raises a few questions. Today's game is set in London of 1807 and revolves around the mystery of the Obra Dinn. The Obra Dinn is an East India Company merchant ship which set out for the Cape of Good Hope in 1802 and was declared lost at sea after never arriving at its destination. You as the player become involved when 5 years later, the Obra Dinn drifts into port with its sails damaged and no signs of life. You play an insurance adjuster for the East India Company who gets the privilege of investigating what took place. Your job is to identify all of the crew members and determine their causes of death. Usually bones don't speak from the grave, but you're lucky enough to have a special watch that allows you to see the moment of someone's death. That's where the story of this game is really developed. Despite having the boring title of Insurance Adjuster, you act as more of a detective. You walk around the ship looking for clues. Bodies, bones, bloodstains, a discharged gun, whatever you can find. From those items, you're able to start learning about the crew of that ship destined for doom. Each clue gives you the opportunity to activate your watch and turn back time. From there, you usually get a few seconds of dialogue on the screen, and then you're presented with the scene of death. You're dropped into a freeze frame of the very moment someone took their last breath, and you're able to walk around to examine details that may have been missed in real time. How did the individual die? What were other people doing at the time? Does their death provide any sort of explanation for the other deaths that occurred? It's through those scenes that the bulk of the narrative is developed. What's incredibly cool is that in addition to your watch, you also have a book of evidence. In it you have a few pictures of the crew, a list of names, a map, a glossary of terms, and most importantly, you have blank pages which fill in as you learn about the fates of each person. Although I could easily get lost in the details of how the story is fleshed out, let's discuss the quality of storytelling. Is the story interesting? Is it compelling? Not only is it both of those things, it's also very clever. It could have been very easy for Lucas Pope to guide you from story to story in a chronological fashion, but what you're actually presented with is a jumbled mix of stories. You might investigate a death 1 minute that happened at the end of the journey, and the next minute you might be investigating a death that took place at the beginning of the journey. Although those memories are put in their proper place in your book, the effect of mixing up the timeline is incredibly effective for giving you a sense of mystery in the game. The entire game is about finding pieces to a puzzle that doesn't make sense at first, and slowly but surely putting them together in a cohesive fashion. The trick to pulling off a game like this really is quality writing, and I believe The Return of the Obra Dinn contains just that. What's interesting is that there isn't actually a ton of dialogue in the game. Death sequences range from having no dialogue to having a few lines of conversation, but as a player, it's easy to sense the sheer volume of lore that surrounds the game. The quality writing goes beyond those written conversations. It's really seen in the amount of detail and care put into each one of the scenes you're presented with. As I've worked my way through the game, I've continued to develop more and more of an interest in the mystery of what happened. I was pleased to find that the deaths weren't just cut and dry. It wasn't just that one guy inflicted everyone with a plague and they all perished. Each character has their own story to tell, and the narrative is much more complex than first meets the eye. Now that you have some knowledge about the narrative in Return of the Obra Dinn, let's discuss what gameplay looks like. Mechanically, this game is incredibly simple. There are very few items you can actually interact with, so the majority of your mechanical play is spent activating your special watch, paging through your log, looking for clues, and solving deaths. Let's walk through an example of what playing this game looks like. We'll look at the first death I found, which is pretty spoiler-free, so no worries on that front. When you first board the ship, your eyes will be quickly drawn to a pile of bones in front of the cabin door. Once you're close to the bones, your hand will lift up and you can activate your death watch. To be completely fair, I actually have no idea what the watch is called, but it has a skull on the front and it allows you to see when people die, so we're going to go with Death Watch. Once you activate the Death Watch, the screen fades to black and you listen. Sometimes the audio will just be gurgling or the sound of flesh being stabbed, but more often than not, there's some dialogue. In this case, you can infer from the dialogue that two men were trying to get into the captain's cabin when, all of a sudden, the captain bursts out and a loud bang rings out. After the audio snippet is complete, you're presented with the scene of death just like we talked about a few minutes ago. In this case, you can see an officer pushing open the door and shooting a pistol at the men in front of him. What's so cool is that you can literally see the bullet's trajectory and the way it rips through the man that was shot. As a quick side note, I don't usually describe the levels of things like language and violence in games, but I will mention that I was surprised by how gruesome some of the deaths in this game were. It's 1 bit, so you're not going to get Mortal Kombat levels of violent detail, but to the extent possible, detail is not spared in how each of the crew members perished. In this case, you can see the blood spraying out of the wounds this man receives. The detail is actually incredibly helpful in terms of the gameplay, but if that sort of stuff makes you squeamish, this could be a game to avoid. Anyways, after the audio, you're able to look around the scene of the crime. Unlike games like The Witcher 3, where Geralt literally solves the mysteries for you after using your Witcher sense, Return of the Obra Dinn is not so simple. Small details are often key to making a proper deduction, and the main tools you have are your eyes, ears, and brain. The objective of the game is simple. Identify 60 crew members, how they died, and who murdered them if they were murdered. It seems simple at first, but the web of complexity binds you very quickly. In the case of the first murder, it's one of the most simple. It's pretty easy to infer that the shooter is the captain. His face matches the captain-looking guy in your picture, he's exiting the captain's quarters, and literally the two men refer to him as captain. So, you make a note of those things, and once you exit the scene of death, your notebook is brought up on the screen. Certain details of the crime are written down, including a picture of the deceased, a picture of the death, a written version of the dialogue, the location of the death, and a highlighted picture of all the people present. From there, you only have to fill in those 3 little blanks. Who is the person? How did they die? And who killed them? 2 of those are pretty easy in this case. They died by being shot by a gun, and they were shot by the captain. Easy peasy. The first blank is still unknown though. The dialogue made no indication of that person's name, and the scene didn't provide any clarity either. From there, that means you need to leave it as unknown until you gain more evidence to know their identity. That right there is the loop. Find a body, listen to dialogue, observe the scene, compare your new knowledge to the information you already know, and repeat. Now that you know the basic cycle of gameplay, let's take a broad look at some strengths and weaknesses of the mechanics. By far, the number one strength of gameplay is how this game makes you feel like an insurance adjusting detective. This is a no-frills kind of game. What you see is what you get, so nearly every detail matters when you're listening to the audio or exploring an area. Sometimes there are 20 people in a scene, and you have to go around looking at where each of them is looking, what they're doing, and whether or not they're speaking. Nothing is highlighted to draw your attention, and as a result, those key observations are completely up to you. Because of that, when you make those important discoveries, you feel so clever, and it pushes you to think outside the box in terms of your deductions. Another strength of gameplay is the mechanic around locking in guesses. Obviously, if the game told you whether or not you were correct every time you made a guess, it would be pretty simple to just try out all the names if that was the piece you were missing. Because Lucas Pope was quite aware of this, answers only lock in pairs of 3. Basically what that means is you have to correctly identify 3 individuals and their causes of death before the game will permanently write those answers in your book. 3 correct answers felt like a good number for balancing the experience. Any fewer and it would have been too easy to guess on everything. Any more and the game would have just felt like too much of a slog. The one weakness I want to bring up is navigation between memories. One of the keys to progressing in Obra Dinn is finding connections between crew members. At least for me, that often meant I wanted to revisit the death scene in case I missed something or in case the new information I knew helped explain the scene better. The frustrating thing was that I couldn't just scroll to that death in my book and jump to the scene. I literally had to walk to wherever the body was on the ship to access it. You can see a small picture of the death in the logbook, but those pictures don't provide any detail beyond how that person died. This weakness didn't ruin the game for me, but I think it would have felt much smoother if I could just click a person in the picture and access any memory they were in. Despite that frustration, the gameplay was amazing overall. It was challenging and also so incredibly rewarding. That brings us to our final points of discussion, art and sound design. I have no doubt that the art will be what stands out most when you first see this game. As I mentioned earlier, the game is a 1-bit, 3D game, essentially meaning that you're in a monochromatic world. Despite only using one color, I'm sure that this world took a lot of time to create. The ship and water around was wonderfully detailed, and Lucas Pope did a great job of creating visual depth as well. As a quick side note, when I say the world is detailed, I don't mean that it's graphically detailed. Because Pope was working in that monochromatic landscape, he had to make some concessions in how some things look, but he made up for that lack of clarity with a rich environment. The main thing visually that I struggled with were fire and explosions. Some of them looked more like giant blobs of white, but despite that undefined look in some spots, I was impressed by how each death scene was a complete recreation of that particular area. What I mean by that is that when you're walking around looking for bodies, the ship is empty and honestly pretty plain. However, when you enter a death scene, it doesn't just add a couple character models to that vanilla looking ship. Tons of new details are added. Boxes are moved, holes are blown in the wood, characters are active, new items appear, the water is different, you name it. Those scenes are generally contained in a small area, but I was still impressed because you get to see so much more than meets the eye. It could be super easy to look at the game map and say, it's so small that could have been super easy to create, but there are so many unique iterations of areas on the map that it felt like you're exploring a new place every time you enter a death sequence. One other super awesome thing visually about this game is your ability to change the color palette in the settings. The default color is heavily inspired by the Mac Plus, so it's called the Macintosh and is a dark brownish tone. However, if you have some sort of crazy grudge against Apple and you prefer a darker, more alien look, you can try out the green IBM 5151 setting. Now, maybe the green is too harsh on your eyes, but you still just hate those black turtlenecks Steve Jobs wore. Luckily, if that's you, you can try out the yellowish tones of the Zenith ZVM 1240. Let's now pretend that PC politics mean nothing to you, but blue is just your favorite color. Thankfully, there's a Commodore 1084 palette made specifically for you. Are you a proponent of neutrals being the best and most non-offensive colors? If so, the soothing IBM 8503 beige tones will probably fit best for you. Last but certainly not least, if you're a millennial hipster who only goes with the latest and greatest, the LCD screen is by far the least mainstream and it's the newest option. There's actually two quick things to mention here. First, I'm most likely colorblind, so no need to correct me on the colors. I no doubt got some of them wrong, so if you want to see them accurately, go look for yourself. Second, the setting is straight up cool. It's nothing more than a color swap and it doesn't really have any real effect on the gameplay, but it's such a fun homage to all of those old school monitors. I have to give some props to Pope for that. On the sound design side, this game also did a great job. The soundtrack was wonderful. It's not an incredibly long score by any means, but it set the perfect tone for the game. Most of the pieces included a lot of stringed instruments with a focus on violin, but there were also some lovely tracks using an organ, harpsichord, and some other instruments I can't even identify. Usually when I listen to soundtracks, I try to write down words and feelings that come to mind, and I'm sure that my playthrough of the game influenced the words that I jotted down this time, but they all seemed to fit super well with Obra Dinn. The songs were nautical, mysterious, ominous, adventurous, and somber, which all fit the theme of, oh shit, how in the world did the whole crew die? Was it planned from the beginning, or did something unexpected show up partway through the voyage? The VO, the voiceover, was also top-notch. It's especially important in a game like this, since someone's distinct voice can be the difference between correctly deducing an identity and not. There weren't any moments where I was cringing because of the voiceover, and each character felt unique enough. Similarly, the sound effects were gruesome, but good. Outside of the sounds of wood creaking and rain hitting the deck, most of the sounds were of people being stabbed, or spiked, or burnt, or crushed. Although those weren't the most pleasant of noises, the Obra Dinn conveyed those events well. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design, let's discuss the positives and negatives of Return of the Obra Dinn. First off, on the positive side, the narrative was compelling. The way it was presented was mysterious, and the actual story content kept me on the edge of my seat. That narrative, accompanied by a quality soundtrack and good VO, really helped to enhance the experience. Second, the way the gameplay fulfills that detective fantasy is incredible. It's a tough game, but it makes you feel incredibly smart every time you make a correct deduction. As I mentioned earlier, this is a no-frill title. There aren't any cheap mechanics made to distract you. This game is centered entirely around one gameplay element, and it delivers on that element. Third, the art is unique in so many ways. It's a fun throwback to old school monitors, it allows brutal deaths to be shown without being overly graphic and gory, and it's just a really cool aesthetic. On the negative side, my biggest gripe with the game is the inability to access death sequences outside of being at the actual body. For a game where the player thrives on getting into a cognitive flow, that inconvenience was an unnecessary distraction. I don't know how all the coding works under the hood, but that seemingly small change would have made the game flow seamlessly. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. If your main goal of gaming is to just veg out and slay a bunch of enemies, I would maybe pass this one up, but for the rest of you, Return of the Obra Dinn is a highly cerebral and satisfying adventure that is definitely worth playing. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen in. If you enjoyed the show or picked up Return of the Obra Dinn because of it, make sure you tell a friend about it and shoot me an email to let me know. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.